Our Old Testament lesson this morning comes from the book of Lamentations, chapter 1, verses 1 through 6. How lonely sits the city that was once full of people. How like a widow she has become. She was the great among the nations. She that was the princess among the provinces has become a vassal. She weeps bitterly in the night, with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has no one to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile with suffering, with hard servitude. She lives now among the nations and finds no resting place. Her pursuers have all overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads to Zion mourn, for no one comes to the festivals. All her gates are desolate. Her priests groan. Her young girls grieve, and her lot is bitter. Her foes have come and become her masters. Her enemies prosper, because the Lord has made her suffer for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children have gone away, captives before the foe. From daughter Zion has departed all her majesty. Her princes have become like stags that have no pasture. They fled without strength before the pursuer. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, that was a cheery passage. Happy World Communion Sunday. Well, Bible scholars have aptly named this in similar texts trauma literature. The year is 587 BC. The nation of Israel had already split from the northern kingdom, Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judah. The northern kingdom had already been overrun and defeated some years before. But the people of Judah were strong. They were a strong people and a brave people. This could never happen to them. But it did happen to them. After two previous invasions, the great king Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon laid final siege on the city of Jerusalem. 4 months into the siege, there was no more food left to eat, and the people were starving. When all hope seemed lost, the army of Judah fled the city, along with King Zedekiah. King Zedekiah and his army were overtaken by the Babylonians on the plains of Jericho. Zedekiah's children were executed in front of him, and his eyes were gouged out, and he was blinded and forced into exile in Babylon. And then on the 7th day of the 5th month of the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, the great Babylonian king sent his commander into the city of Jerusalem, and he plundered it and set it ablaze. Jerusalem was laid to waste, and Judah's neighbors had abandoned her. The Arameans, the Ammonites, and the Moabites, they had joined in the attacks on the land of Judah, and Judah had nowhere left to turn. Nebuchadnezzar carried all of Jerusalem into exile. Only the poorest people were left behind, forced to tend the vineyards and work the fields. It was a dark day for Judah indeed. You can find the details of this story in 2 Kings chapters 24 and 25. And so we have this poem of grief in the book of Lamentations. All sense of security is gone. The future is unknown. The homeland was destroyed. The king was imprisoned in a foreign land, and all of his heirs were killed. It was a moment of utter despair. The nation of Judah would be no more. Perhaps the closest thing we have in our collective memory was the attacks of September 11th, when airplanes took down the Twin Towers and slammed into the Pentagon. We had a new sense of vulnerability, a sense of disbelief. How could this happen? The future was filled with uncertainty and fear. Our very way of life was under attack. For Judah, this was not only a national crisis, it was also a crisis of faith. You see, when Nebuchadnezzar plundered Jerusalem, he looted and burned the temple. And in these ancient times, when your army was destroyed and your kingdom was overrun, it was understood that your God was too weak. So when the temple, God's dwelling place, was burned to the ground, all those biblical covenant promises seemed to go up in smoke as well. Truly, all was lost. But we know that's not the rest of the story, don't we? We know that God's promises are sure, that Jerusalem would emerge from the ashes, and that God's story would not end that day. Now, it took the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel to help the people of Judah envision a new future. They had to learn to understand God in new ways. No longer would God be bound by a physical dwelling place in the temple. Rather, God would be among God's people wherever they found themselves. Now, today is World Communion Sunday. And in this World Communion Sunday, God is a global God, dwelling amongst all of God's people around the world, across space and across time, throughout history and long into the future. As we gather at the communion table, we gather with a great cloud of witnesses, worshiping God together in different tongues and different cultures. On the altar today and on the communion rail, we have fabrics from all over the world that members of our congregation and our ESL program shared with us, representing God's people. It's a cacophony of colors and fabrics and textures and patterns. If we tried to put it all together into one quilt, it would truly be a hot mess. And so too is our world politics today, isn't it not? Yet all people use fabrics of cotton and silk and wool. We all share a common humanity as we weave for warmth and for clothing and for beautiful adornment. And so we must look to God to do what we cannot, to bring harmony out of chaos, to bring unity out of multiplicity, to bring beauty in diversity. And so God is weaving. God is weaving a beautiful tapestry where every strand and every knot and every tear has its place. Now, all we see is the messy tangles and the knots and the dangling threads. But faith is the anticipation that one day we will get to stand before God and gaze upon the tapestry from above and be awed by its beauty and its wholeness. But as we stand before the altar on World Communion Sunday today, we're quickly reminded that we're still looking at the underside of that tapestry. We're still living in trauma literature today. We think of the destroyed cities and the wartime atrocities and the mothers whose children will not return from the battlefield in Ukraine. We think of the Rohingya in Myanmar, the Uyghurs in China, peoples oppressed by those in power. We think of South Sudan and Ethiopia and Mali and Nigeria and Azerbaijan and Armenia, where conflicts continue to rage. We think of Afghanistan and Syria and the desperation of refugees fleeing war. We think of Haiti and Venezuela and failing governments that leave their people in desperation. We think of the people of Pakistan and the people of Florida, suffering from natural disasters that have been magnified by human misstewardship of God's creation. Indeed, we have much to lament today, and we're only just scratching the surface. And lament need not be a collective expression of grief. Lament can also be intensely personal as well. So many have been lost in the opioid crisis in our towns and cities. So many have suffered in the COVID epidemic. So many lives have been shattered by gun violence. So many fight bravely against cancer. So many wrestle with mental illness, with crushing grief at the loss of a loved one, and with various forms of brokenness of spirit. Indeed, we have much to lament today. But even here we know that that's not the rest of the story, don't we? We know that God's promises are sure. The sun will rise tomorrow. The birds will sing, because we are an Easter people. We serve a forever God. We serve a world communion kind of God. Now, it may seem like it's gloomy this morning, and overcast, and raining. And it may be overcast and gloomy and raining tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. Just keep getting out of bed. And remember, you are truly never alone. And that brings us to the epistle lesson this morning. Scholars sometimes refer to 2 Timothy as the Apostle Paul's last will and testament of faith, written from jail before his execution. Some of Paul's earlier letters, from the book of Philippians, for example, were also written from prison. But these were written during his first imprisonment in Rome, which looked more like house arrest. During his first imprisonment, people could visit and freely come and go. This time around was different. You see, world events had shifted on Paul. As he returned from his missionary journey, scholars believe possibly in Spain, the Roman world had soured on Christians. There had been a great fire in Rome, and the Emperor Nero needed a scapegoat. And so he blamed Christians for the fire. Christians became persona non grata. They were persecuted. They were imprisoned, and they were executed. Now, at roughly the same time, there was also a Jewish uprising in Jerusalem against Rome, and that was about to be brutally suppressed as well. And the temple in Jerusalem would once again be destroyed, and to this day never rebuilt. No longer could Paul's friends protect him, and Paul's second imprisonment would be his last. Indeed, as Paul wrote these words, awaiting the executioner's final blow, he had plenty to lament. But Paul's letter doesn't read like a lament at all. It's a praise-filled, thanks-filled letter of hope. Why? Because Paul had discovered what the people of Judah during the Babylonian exile could not yet see. God wins. Paul's life had been transformed by Jesus Christ. The cross was not the end of the story, and the communion meal is not a solemn act of grief, but a celebration of life. Paul knew the miracle of Easter. Evil does not triumph in this world, even though it sure may look that way from time to time. No, Jesus wins the final victory. And so even in death, death cannot have the final word. You see, lament leads to hope, and hope leads to love. Take another look at Paul's greeting in verse 5. Notice what he's doing here. He lifts up two godly women, Lois and Eunice, who have brought faith with them, and they have passed it on through the generations, passing on hope and promise of Christ. I'm sure you probably have some women like that in your life as well, who bring hope and joy and the confidence of knowing that you are loved. Perhaps it's time for you to be a woman or a man like that for someone else. You see, we don't have to curse the darkness because we know the source of light. Instead, let the candle shine brightly for all to see. This communion table is a victory table. But this table doesn't belong in here. It belongs out in the world. The plastic tables we use at the food distributions at the public library or at our hot meal distributions for the homeless, they're just an extension of this victory table. The tables in our ESL classrooms and in our preschool classrooms, they too can just be extensions of this victory table. And so can your dinner table and your office table. But only if you make them tables of hope, tables of love, tables that embody God's victory over the darkness. And that means letting God win that victory in yourself first. Now, I was supposed to preach a stewardship sermon today, given that Stewardship Commitment Sunday is just around the corner. And that's the day when we ask you to prayerfully pledge your support for the work of the Lord here in this church through our ministries for the coming year in 2023. And so my stewardship message is this: don't give to the church because you feel obligated or compelled or guilted into it. That's lament giving. Don't even give because the church needs your money, which, by the way, we do. No, if you're going to give to this church, do so because God is doing something in your heart and in your life. Do so because you believe that what this church is trying to do in the world to make it better for those around us in the name of Christ is what we're called to. Do so because you believe this can be a table of hope and a table of victory for you and for someone else. Victory over addiction, over grief, over loneliness, over hunger, over despair. God doesn't need your money. God needs your heart. And when God has your heart, then God will use your money, and all the rest of you too, to be a candle that leads someone else out of the darkness. Remember, God is a great weaver. God will use your fabric, and your fabric, and your fabric, and yours. And God is weaving in heaven. Yes, but God is also weaving right here on earth, turning lament into hope, and hope into love, and love into joy. Amen.